Hello, I'm Marc Tracy. I'm a staff writer at the New Republic. I'm here with John Koblin, a reporter at Deadspin. We're gonna do some talking about sports today. Say hi to everyone, John.
What's up, Mark? How are you?
I'm great. We should disclose, because this is probably gonna run on Monday, that we're recording this Sunday around noon. So we don't know the results of the two NFL playoff games being played today, which is especially consequential for me as a Redskins fan. We have the 4:30 game today. Maybe I will be very happy tomorrow. Maybe I'll be very sad tomorrow. We discussed recording this later, after the game, but I figured that would be too sort of Cousin Sal on Bill Simmons' podcast. I would either be really elated or really depressed, and either way it would be really obnoxious.
Hold on, Mark. This is already this is a document. This is a document for history, because we're about 4 hours before game time. How are you feeling right now? I wouldn't be able to do this if the Jets were playing in the playoffs in 4 hours. How are you doing right now?
I'm actually doing pretty okay. There was no way we could expect to go 10-6 and win the NFC East before this season, so the expectations have already been exceeded. I feel more confident about the game than I probably should, given how good the Seahawks are. But I actually feel pretty confident. If I were a betting man, I would bet on the Redskins.
Well, of course you feel confident. You haven't experienced a loss in 2 months. So of course you're feeling excited right now, and you should feel confident. But here's the one thing I'll say about, as far as the playoffs are concerned. Now, this is not unlike the Jets, my team, what the New York Jets did in 2009. Just sort of surprisingly got into the playoffs, where the team was in early to mid to late November to where it is in early January. And you can feel, because we've exceeded all expectations, we're doing great, you're playing with a lot of house money. If we lose, it's one of the rare times where you have a moral victory and say, we did unbelievable. RG3 is only a rookie, just like Mark Sanchez was only a rookie.
We beat the Cowboys in the NFC East title game, effectively, which already is great.
Already amazing. But here's the thing. In today's NFL, I feel like there is never a moment in which you are playing with house money. You're in the playoffs right now, and that means you're all in. Like, it is now officially, sort of a Steinbrenner world, it's Super Bowl or bust at this point, because you don't know what's going to happen 2 years from now. Is RG3 going to be hurt? What's going to happen here? Fluke fumble, yada, yada, yada. You have to be all in at this point. I feel like there are no moral victories.
I think the Steinbrenner rule actually comes from football. He was a football guy. He basically, what made Steinbrenner so weird in baseball was he treated baseball as though it was football. And then football, you have to win the championship. And that's actually when people, before it became clear that this was the case, when the Redskins traded the whole boatload of picks to St. Louis in order to essentially get 4 spots up and be able to take RG3, my defense of that, which I obviously stand by now, is that the object isn't to build, a good team. The object is to win the Super Bowl, even one Super Bowl. And to do that, you basically need an elite quarterback. And it seemed like RG3 and Luck were going to be the elite quarterbacks, and so we kind of had to get them. Now, as it turns out, there might have been a third elite quarterback in last year's draft, Russell Wilson, who went in the 3rd round, who, as additional sort of insult to my family, this is the other thing that makes me, don't get me wrong, I'm rooting 110% for the Redskins, but my dad went to Wisconsin. I'm a Wisconsin fan. I've been following Russell Wilson for, well, not for years, because he only played for Wisconsin for a year, but last year, and going into last year's draft, I knew Russell Wilson was great. And it's funny, all year they've been talking about how he's been throwing so few interceptions, and how he's going to regress to the mean of throwing more interceptions, and they don't realize that Russell Wilson doesn't throw interceptions, and he's a likable guy, very similar to Griffin in many ways. So it turns out that maybe, as my dad, of course, the Wisconsin homer, was saying all the time, that we shouldn't have made any of the trades, we should have just drafted Russell Wilson. Right. But this is what happened. We are here in the playoffs. It's a great feeling. I guess stuff's going on with your team, right? There was some Jets news.
Do we have to talk about my team? I'd almost prefer if we didn't. I'm enjoying living vicariously through you, thinking you have a playoff game to watch in 4 hours. Oh God, my team is not. I mean,
no discussion of the tattoo.
I mean, let me just put it this way. I mean, the Jets obviously. We all knew. All Jets fans knew going in this was going to be an incredibly dark year. We all knew that it was going to be something terrible was going to happen. The second the Jets acquired Tim Tebow, we seemed destined to having just an ugly, ugly, bad season in some way. And even considering that, there is no way any of us could have possibly expected that a week after the season we'd be talking about how Rex Ryan has a tattoo of his wife wearing a Mark Sanchez jersey up on his right arm. I mean, it's been an ugly, terrible year, which is not surprising considering the Jets are an old team. The Jets went all in 2009, 2010, and then they thought they could get away with it in 2011, which was not a great idea, but it was a team after 13 games that was 8-5, and they lost the last 3 games of the year, which is something the Jets franchise weirdly has a habit of doing. They've done that several times. They did it once in 93. They did it once in the year 2000. But what was worse is the fact that they expected to do it again this year. They thought that they could take the same core talent that led them to the AFC Championship in 2009 and 2010, and all this was contingent on the fact that Mark Sanchez would take strides. He would improve in some way. And obviously, A, that didn't happen, and B, he became a much worse quarterback. So here we are now talking about our GM search. Is Rex even going to survive the other end of the GM search? Woody Johnson, the Jets owner, has already said, yes, Rex Ryan will return, but stranger things have happened, and depending on who the Jets hire for a new GM, maybe Rex isn't back. It's just been an ugly. I mean, basically, I feel like where the Redskins were a decade ago is just what the Jets are beginning to settle into right now.
You have to, if you're where the Redskins are a decade ago, then I think you have to bring back Rich Kotite the way we brought back Joe Gibbs.
That's right, because Rich Kotite is our Joe Gibbs. I mean,
Quick question: as someone who doesn't watch necessarily most of the Jets games, but watches a few, catches them, certainly when they were good and they were playing the Pats and there were close games. I know this sounds silly given the tabloid mentality of what's going on. Has Sanchez been appreciably worse? Because I seem to remember he was never great. He had Brian Schottenheimer as the offensive coordinator. They always found ways to sort of like make it work, especially in 2009, 2009. I just think they remember 2010. They were struggling midseason, and they went to Pittsburgh. And, this is when Pittsburgh good. Maybe Polamalu was injured that game. Maybe he wasn't. But, they won. Sanchez put together a good game, and the narrative changed, and then they made the playoffs again. They went to the championship game again. I mean, has it been appreciably worse this year in terms of quarterback play from Sanchez?
Yes. Okay. It doesn't seem like it, because especially if you stare at the numbers, they don't look dramatically different. They almost, especially from 2010 to 2012, they look a little worse, but not a lot worse. But yes, the thing about Mark is, I think you can trace it. He was actually a good quarterback in 2010. Let me put it this way.
Yeah.
Going into the championship games in 2010, in the AFC Championship, you had the Steelers and you had the Jets. So you had Big Ben on the Steelers side, guy who's already won a couple Super Bowls. And for the Jets, you had Mark Sanchez, who was in his second year and was, coming off an AFC Championship bid. Over in the NFC, you had the Bears and Packers. So you had Aaron Rodgers on one side and you had Jay Cutler on the other. The narrative going into those games that day was, we are going to emerge from these championship games and we're going to anoint a new quarterback for a new era. Could be Aaron Rodgers, could be Mark Sanchez. Who's it going to be? Obviously the Steelers and the Packers won those games. And then Rodgers won the Super Bowl 2 weeks later. Mark Sanchez was a pretty good quarterback back in 2010. I mean, yes, the Jets were a run-first team back then. They had their offensive line was stronger. The running game was better. And Mark Sanchez...
It was a classic Schottenheimer offense.
With the Schottenheimer offense. But the Jets were still ranked 11th in the league in total offense that year. I mean, at worst, they were mediocre. And at best, they were actually better than average. And the defense was top 3. I mean, I think it was the third-ranked defense in the NFL that year. But Mark was showing signs of improvement. The consensus was, especially going into the 2011 season, going into last season, is that Mark Sanchez is not a bust. The question is he a good quarterback or a very good quarterback? And something happened in 2011 on a Sunday Night Football game, I wonder if you remember this, against the Ravens, pretty early in the season.
Yes.
Sanchez got destroyed in that game. Destroyed. And ever since that game, this guy has not been the same quarterback. And this year, again, he started off the season. The Jets put up 48 points against Buffalo in the opening game. He started off looking good. Somehow, by the time we got to the midpoint of the season, and especially toward the end of the season, and the two games you can look at were the Titans game, the Monday night game, where Mark threw up, I think, 4 interceptions, and the Buffalo game to finish the year out, where Mark Sanchez was, you could look at him. He was just, it was as bad as you'll ever see a quarterback in the NFL. It was terrible. So, yeah, somewhere along the way, we went from saying conclusively this guy is not a bust and he actually could be quite good to, oh, my God, what have we been doing for the last 4 years? This guy had,
and what contract
and
did he
the
give him?
Contract extension that he was given last offseason, where he is going to be on the hook for a lot of money next year. So if the Jets want to get rid of Mark Sanchez, you're giving up a lot of your salary cap, and if you want to keep him, that's just one more year to have to basically let him ride the bench, because I don't know how he could possibly be a starter for this team next year.
Right. Well, fortunately, we have a long off season to contemplate.
I know. What are we going to do on Sunday? Sundays once again, we're going to have to solve these days and come up with plans and things. That sounds really terrible. I don't want to do that.
I know. We're going to have to, we're literally going to have to look forward to Girls Night. That's actually what we're going to be doing, which is depressing.
That's really depressing.
So, moving on a bit, I identified John here earlier in the show as a reporter at Deadspin, reporting the news, and that's true enough. But John also recently was a part of the news, a small part of the news, involving really what to non-sports fans they might not realize is probably the single most important institution in American sports, which is not any of the leagues, but is the behemoth, the $40 billion behemoth known as ESPN. John, you want to tell us about your ESPN news making?
Yes, because that was a really wacky experience. So basically, I've been covering ESPN now for about 8 months, because that's when I got to Deadspin. And before I got to Deadspin, I covered other media institutions that were located in the city, like the New York Times, Condé Nast, Wall Street Journal, stuff like that. So within the first few months of covering ESPN, now Deadspin has traditionally had sort of a very adversarial, contentious relationship with ESPN. But, I came in as, Mr. Objective Reporter. I don't need to come in with a lot of ill will. But inevitably, I wound up taking that position just because I was surprised at a lot of the things that I wound up seeing. There were a lot of examples of sort of journalistic crimes that were coming up from Bristol, Connecticut, that I was sort of surprised to see. There were moments of plagiarism on SportsCenter. There were moments where athletes, prominent European athletes, were accusing, one German soccer player accused ESPN of actually making up a story entirely. There were all sorts of weird sourcing issues. There was the fact that they had a scam artist writing a weekly column for them. And it kind of gave me pause. I should
interject and say that John wrote sort of the seminal... what was her name again,
Phillips.
just so people can Google it after? Right.
So Sarah Phillips. Yeah, so they had,
people should check out John's article.
So they had, now when I saw all these things happen, I'm like, gosh, this wouldn't happen at ABC News. Why is this happening so much at ESPN? So that gave me pause, the fact that that was happening. And talked about it with my editor, the great Tommy Craggs, and said, can we do a piece on ESPN's journalism? Because this is really kind of surprising and weird. And he said, sure. So as I started working on that, we found yet another example where one of ESPN's senior writers, a person who used to be an editor, a guy named Lynn Hoppes, had what we found plagiarized at least a dozen stories he had written, parts of his stories, straight from Wikipedia. He just copied and pasted straight from Wikipedia. These are not what you would call crucial items on ESPN.com. These are not stories on the front page. This is buried in ESPN's playbook section, which is formerly its page 2 section, which is where we found Bill Simmons for the first time about a decade ago. We said, wow, those are a lot of examples of plagiarism. So we wound up writing a story about it. ESPN wound up, quickly coming out with a statement referring to it as journalistically lazy. And it was, obviously, or was certainly a crime. But, Lynn wasn't fired, which, whatever, that's often. You will have a plagiarist or even a serial plagiarist on your payroll at a news outfit, and that person won't be fired sometimes, whatever. That's just institution. But the thing that was most surprising, months later, as I'm doing another story on ESPN's infatuation with Tim Tebow, the Jets' backup quarterback, who did not play this year.
Third string.
You're right. Yes, the Jets' third-string quarterback, a guy who was essentially a special teams player. As I'm working on that, I was thinking, whatever happened with those Lynn Hoppes stories? What corrections did they wind up giving those stories? Wind up going and looking in the archives and realizing those stories existed exactly as they had 4 months earlier when we had written our original item about him. Thinking, that's odd. They called this journalistically lazy, and obviously there's something wrong with the fact that he plagiarized from Wikipedia, and yet they didn't wind up correcting any of these stories. That's really weird. So I wound up including that fact in a bigger story about ESPN's journalistic issues. I go back a week later, the stories still haven't been corrected, so we wind up doing a couple follow-ups, saying, why hasn't ESPN corrected this? We went ahead and brought in some bigwigs from the media world, Jack Schaefer, David Carr, Dan Okren, all big names and all very credible names, and they all wound up saying, yeah, this is weird. Jack Schaefer said, out of all the examples, the hundreds of examples of plagiarism that I've seen over the years, I've never seen a place that just sort of willfully ignored as widely documented an allegation of plagiarism as we had, as we had sent forth to ESPN. So, wound up doing these stories.
In other words, usually, just for people who may not usually pay attention to this, usually when there's an allegation of plagiarism, the first thing the news organization does after checking on that initial instance is saying, okay, we're taking this seriously, we're going to conduct an internal investigation, and actually, the sort of rule of plagiarism is plagiarists almost never plagiarize once. It is almost by definition a serial crime. It's just the type of circumstances or person that would commit plagiarism or lead to plagiarism usually leads to multiple plagiarisms. And so the organization will usually say, we're going to conduct a serious internal investigation. A month or two later, they'll release the results of that investigation. They'll say, this is how either the person's cleared or the person's not cleared, and this is how we're disciplining them, up to and including firing. We're going to correct the post, and there's going to be a note that it originally appeared with plagiarism, etc. There was none of that.
None of that, exactly. So you would think on some of these stories you would see some sort of correction where it said the story has been updated. Whatever. You don't have to sit there and go crazy and say the story was plagiarized. Nothing like that. Just some sort of update, some sort of correction, just some acknowledgement that something wrong happened, and this isn't up to our standards. Some acknowledgement, that one completely ignored. So, whatever. We're working on it. We were actually working on yet another follow-up of that, which we never got around to, which would have been pure joy, which is I was going to just reach out to some of ESPN's biggest journalistic names, bold-faced names in the journalism world at large, and just ask them on the record. You give me an on-the-record comment. What do you think about this?
Do you think they would have talked to you / did any of them talk to you?
I don't know. I didn't get to that. I did not get to that stage. But the fact that either way, I feel like it would have worked because, I feel like some people would have just come out and said, okay, I have to say something because I do find this to be wrong. And I know that quite a large number of them did find it wrong because I've spoken to them off the record over the previous 4 months. Or B, they wind up saying no comment, which would also speak volumes.
Which is newsworthy.
Yeah,
itself.
What's happening up in Bristol? What are you doing to these?
There's been issues with ESPN. There was the time, one of the things about ESPN, one of the great things of their success is they have a star system which has almost no stars. You're expected. This was the big problem with Olbermann because Olbermann was clearly a star and he wasn't allowed to be a star. There are a few exceptions. Chris Berman is the most obvious ESPN star. Bill Simmons is the most obvious sort of I built my brand despite ESPN and I'm a star within their orbit, Rick Riley also, but they generally don't have like stars in the way other networks might have stars. And Bill Simmons, maybe a year or two ago, tweeted something about an ESPN affiliate station in Boston that was saying mean things about him and was suspended on Twitter for like a week. I may have my facts slightly wrong here, but basically there's definitely some precedent at ESPN for them really not wanting, not airing dirty laundry. They're really very much a not air dirty laundry.
And even more so than other traditional news outfits. I mean...
one of these things, I wanted you to finish your story, but like, as long as we're on this, like, well, finish your story, then I'll get to that.
I'll make it super quick. So anyway, I am just going to work one day, and this is early December, so this is probably a week or two or a few weeks after we started following up, like, where the Lynn Hoppes corrections, to which, by the way, when I would reach out to ESPN, I would get no comment. The spokesperson would say no comment, which is weird. And John Walsh, John Walsh is the guy who came to ESPN in the late 1980s. He's somebody you probably never heard of. He was somebody who was a guy who worked at, Rolling Stone, and Rolling Stone was super, when it was the thing in the like early to mid 70s. This is a guy who has a really strong journalistic background. Edited a sports magazine in the early 1980s. It was a cult favorite. This guy is, he's a journalistic legend, especially in the sports world. And he was speaking at a University of Maryland journalism class, a college class, a room full of college juniors and seniors. And he came down because the class was taught by a former ombudsman at ESPN named George Solomon. And in the class, this kid, wonderfully enough, is named Mark Sanchez, kid who grew up in Maplewood, New Jersey, and asked him a question about the Lynn Hoppes stories and said, why haven't you corrected this? And John Walsh wound up dismissing the fact that Deadspin wound up covering those stories, according to Mark and a few of his classmates, because we were writing about Lynn Hoppes and brought it back up several months after our original item, because he was involved in some sort of romantic rivalry. I was involved in some sort of romantic rivalry with Lynn Hoppes, me, John Koblin, and because...
Well, he specifically said it was a woman.
And he specifically said it was an ex-girlfriend. And now the reason we knew about this is because Mark and another classmate of his were tweeting at the event. So they wound up tweeting. So all of a sudden, I get out of the subway one day, and I see that I've been tweeted at, and it says that this is the reason why those stories were written. Now, obviously, I'm a little confused from the get-go, mostly because it's untrue, but also because I've never had a girlfriend. I've had a boyfriend for the last 3 years, and immediately I expected that he had to be joking. This had to be a joke. There is no way that he could possibly be serious about this or believe this. So, I wind up tweeting something back that just is, jokey as well, something along the lines of, let me knock down the latest straight rumor, I'm gay. My boyfriend would be very surprised.
I remember that one. Let me knock down the latest straight rumor.
So I wind up just, whatever, just, being jokey back, because I'm assuming that he's just kidding. And then, within an hour or two, I get a call from Bristol, Connecticut, from ESPN's PR department, and the spokesman said, John Walsh wants to speak to you. I said, okay, that sounds good to me. Put him on the line. And we wind up talking on the phone. And we wind up talking off the record for a few minutes. And I said, look, can we put this on the record? And he said, sure. So then we go on the record, and I said, look, were you kidding when you brought up that whole romantic rivalry thing? I assumed it was just a bot joke of like, yeah, they did that. This is the equivalent of they feel so spurned by ESPN because they can't get jobs there. It's like we broke up with them at some point. I was assuming it was some awful joke like that. So I said, were you kidding? And he says, no, I wasn't kidding. That's what I heard, that there was some sort of romantic rivalry involved. And I'm like, wow, he really, really meant this. So wind up writing about an ESPN executive, one of ESPN's vice presidents, their executive editor, who was actually going to a college class and saying the reason that we were writing the story was the fact that it had to do with some sort of romantic dispute, instead of the fact that it had to do with plagiarism. And to that kid's credit who asked the question, he asked a follow-up question and said, SportsCenter recently plagiarized a report from Yahoo Sports. Can you talk about that? And John Walsh replied, saying something along the lines of, it's not plagiarism, that was just lazy and stupid. To which the kid replied, to his credit, if I did that in this class, I would get an F. I would fail this class if I wound up doing something like that. So...
This kid's going places.
I know, the kid's...
Mark Sanchez.
Yeah, that's what we thought 2 years ago. But no, I mean, I never would have done what that kid did. It was amazing. But this just sheds so much light on ESPN and its journalistic practice. Here is the journalistic soul of ESPN. Not to, at the very least, let's pretend it was true. Let's pretend there was a romantic rivalry involved between me and Lynn Hoppes and some girl. Let's pretend that was true.
The fact that there couldn't possibly have been is almost like, it's funny, but like it almost is a distraction from the real issue here.
The plagiarism. Exactly. He still plagiarized. It wouldn't matter what motivation I had to do the story. He still plagiarized. That's not in dispute. And then shortly after this is all it took. Was the fact that he had to have an ESPN executive embarrassing himself in a public forum. They wound up updating and correcting all those Lynn Hoppes stories. It only took 4 months and only took to get to that level of ridiculousness. But yeah, I mean, that's what, and you know, what was funny is Nick Denton, our overlord at Deadspin, the guy who owns Gawker Media, what Nick said was funny. Nick wasn't even insulted by the fact, or wasn't even disturbed by the fact that an ESPN executive was gossiping. He was most disturbed by the fact that the ESPN executive had botched the gossip, which I thought was pretty hilarious.
Right, the Cardinal sin of Gawker.
Exactly, coming from the Gawker overlord, the gossip merchant himself. But you know what's weird about it is you have a place, and one of the things that ESPN really prides itself on is the fact that it is located in Bristol, Connecticut, which is quite a drive from New York City. I mean, it's in the middle of nowhere, essentially. And when you have a moment like this, you can almost see the disadvantage of being located in Bristol because you can, A, you're just a little bit, you're pretty remote, and B, ESPN is the only thing that's important. It's just all about ESPN. Nobody's opening the windows over there and seeing that there is a bigger sports world, and that's often how ESPN winds up finding itself in some trouble spots, especially with some of its journalistic issues, is the fact that it's a little insulated up there, and they need to open the windows a little bit more from time to time. And this is especially true on shows like First Take, the Skip Bayless and Stephen A. Smith Hour. But with that said, you wrote a story in TNR about ESPN, about the good side of ESPN, and the fact that they can do, I mean, when they do journalism well, they do it better than anybody. Can you tell us actually just a little bit about that story?
Well, so it's almost a little scary to me because I almost see it as like a future of journalism type thing. I don't want to be a disaster merchant for journalism, partly because I don't want to, partly because I'm not expert enough to say. But I think it is safe to say that places like ESPN, which are just gulp up profit, I mean, the amount of money they make is unbelievable. Those places are going to be an increasing, or think of Bloomberg, for example, which runs a great magazine, Bloomberg Business Week, has the news service, probably does make money, but that's not where Bloomberg the company makes most of its profits. It makes most of its profits through the terminals, through the financial services stuff.
And we know that Business Week loses more than $10 million a year.
Right, Business Week does lose money, that's right. And great for them. And there's no evidence, certainly, I mean, Business Week's a fabulous magazine. I don't mean to analogize, there's no evidence that it's been corrupted or anything like that. It's just, and there's no evidence, I mean, that's the other thing, there's no evidence that sort of aspects of the good ESPN, the examples I cited, because they're sort of similar, with the 30 for 30 series, the documentary series, Grantland, which people have quibbles with Grantland, but it's usually not this sort of quibble. They might think, we don't like the sensibility, which is a very different sort of criticism than, they're plagiarizing, which no one would say. Their E60 series, their Outside the Line series, this is good journalism. And so the interesting question I had is sort of like, is this a canary in the coal mine? Is this like the future of lots of journalism, particularly investigative journalism, which requires a real kind of investment of of resources in terms of reporters' time, in terms of money, in terms of actual time. Like a reporter on an investigative story isn't going to be able to work on other things for some time. And there's really important stuff that isn't necessarily the most popular stuff. Like, who's going to be funding this in the future? Like, we have nonprofits like ProPublica, which are dedicated to doing exactly this sort of work, and that cropped up precisely because there is a sense that, especially at the local level, but even at the national level, there are less resources for this sort of journalism. So in sports, where there's a real need for investigative journalism, I mean, one of the examples I cited was the partnership that Outside the Lines is doing with Frontline on head trauma in the NFL, which is obviously a massively important issue, one that, whose revelations could arguably go against ESPN's own interests, given that Monday Night Football is the highest rated show on cable. And my question is sort of, is this the future of journalism? But there's also the narrower question, also important, of, which ESPN, there's the good angel ESPN and the bad angel ESPN, and, it's not so much a question of which is going to win out, because they probably can both coexist, and they're going to appeal to different people, and the bad angel is probably going to be a little more popular. It's certainly cheaper, certainly easier, but the question is, can they coexist in the same company? And, I guess the jury's probably still out on that to some extent. Grantland, for example, which doesn't really do investigative stuff, but they do, it's an interesting magazine that's certainly untainted by all this stuff. That almost arose out of a pretty unique set of circumstances of Bill Simmons just being sort of this real exception that proves the rule within ESPN, as far as I can tell, of just having the sort of star power you're not really allowed to have there, and being able to say, as part of, I don't know if this is officially reported, but it seems pretty clear, he was renegotiating his contract, and lo and behold, less than a year after renegotiating his contract, he had this new toy to play with, Grantland, which clearly has ample resources. So I guess the question is, like, is this a viable model for the future of ESPN and for journalism? What are your thoughts on sort of the good versus bad ESPN? I think you're probably more skeptical than
Yeah, it's absolutely always going to be a viable model for ESPN, because it doesn't matter. ESPN is, as you said earlier, worth $40 billion, and as long as they're getting their subscription fees, the huge amount of money they're getting from sub fees. When we pay our cable bill, $5 per person is sending it over to ESPN, and that's not even including ESPN2. We're sending more than $5 up to Bristol, and that is so much more than any other cable channel. So ESPN is always going to be an ATM machine. They're always going to have a ton of cash, and as a result, they can always do sort of investigative journalism that requires the resources that you describe, the time that you describe, and the manpower as well. You need a few people who are going to be able to invest that sort of time, and you want, obviously, really good journalists to be able to do that. So yeah, ESPN is going to be doing that as long as the cable system model as we know it continues to exist.
Which is something of an open question, actually.
That is, and that's definitely that's the biggest fear is what happens.
That they're going to a la carte, but even if they go to a la carte, the most popular station will be ESPN, yes. But it'll still probably.
And that's one of the reasons why ESPN has gotten so good about buying as many live rights to different sporting events and for as long as possible, because as long as they have that, people are going to watch college football games. People are going to watch Monday Night Football. So long people want to watch Major League Baseball throughout the season. So long as they have that, they are okay, because that makes it essential. It makes ESPN essential, and that's obviously a really strong business model. But with that said, yeah, of course they can coexist. The thing is, I don't think the bad angel at ESPN needs to exist. They don't have it. There's no reason for it to exist, and that's what's been so strange covering ESPN for the past 8 months. This doesn't need to exist. It's so needless. They're going to make money regardless of the fact, or regardless of whether they correct Lynn Hopp's stories. They're not going to lose any money from that. The only thing, they're not going to become significantly poorer if they wind up covering Tim Tebow a little bit less. So, as you said, the third string quarterback of the New York Jets. And what ESPN does well They do really well. I mean, and when it comes to, I mean, right now, this past week, yes, it's playoff week for people like Mark, but for people like me, rooting for the Jets, it's an important week of who's getting fired, what head coaches are getting fired around the league, and who's interviewing whom for
and hockey is back.
Future GM,
just this morning.
GM jobs, and who's breaking every one of the stories. ESPN's Adam Schefter, Chris Mortensen. I mean, they lead the way on that. They are doing. It's ridiculous, right? I mean, Adam Schefter is going to break everything.
It's funny. I think people who are familiar with other areas of coverage, but not football coverage, don't recognize. I don't think there's an analog to Adam Schefter in terms of number of scoops broken. Like in politics, it'd be like all the scoops BuzzFeed gets and Politico gets and the Times get and the
He's
Post
like
gets
Mike Allen times 3. I mean, that's like.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
He really runs the whole show. It's unbelievable. So you have that as far as quick news is concerned, and then they have what you wrote about in terms of the investigative journalism and head injuries, which, on the one hand, now this is sort of an older narrative because for the past decade, the narrative has been, can ESPN broadcast NFL games and simultaneously report things that the NFL wouldn't be happy about. And they have proven time and time again that they can. And they can do it quite well. So that is sort of an older narrative, and they'll continue to do that. So that's why, I think you're right as far as the good angel and bad angel thing. Can they coexist? Yeah, they will coexist. I am interested in seeing a little bit less of the bad angel in 2013. And considering that ESPN did have a little bit of a rough year, and that its president, the guy who runs the whole place, John Skipper, had to come out at the end of the year and disavow some of the Tebow coverage and say, we went too far with that. That wasn't our best moment. Gives me some hope that, yes, 2013 will not be – I won't have to write a follow-up piece saying what the hell's going on with ESPN's journalism because they don't need the bad angel. We can just – I would love to just celebrate it. Everybody just wants to celebrate it because they do have such a monopoly on the sports world. And, we put out that big number and say they're worth $40 billion, which is, something that Forbes reported a couple months ago. But Forbes also reported that every NFL team is worth $35 billion combined, meaning that ESPN is bigger than every other NFL team combined. So it's so big and so huge, and we're going to continue to rely on it for everything. NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball. You want to see the best ESPN possible. I mean, I don't think it's a problem asking for that. And yes, hopefully we won't have to deal with the good angel and bad angel stuff because it'll just be a good angel all the time, although I'm being really Pollyannish with that thought probably.
Actually, the one reason I would guess there probably won't be a good angel all the time is, you just look at the programming. You look at the ESPN2 programming all day, and it's just debate show after debate show. They give them different names. Some of them are better than others, pardon the interruptions, maybe better than that abhorrent one with what was the one Skip Bayless is usually on?
First Take.
Right, they had the comments about Griffin a couple weeks ago, which made the news. And I mean, that doesn't always have to happen, but there's always going to be things like when you have debate shows, there's always going to be a lowest common denominator. They're always going to end up talking about Tebow. But you got to figure the reason they have these debate shows is they're must be incredibly cheap and easy to produce. They need to fill that slate. Like, if we want to get much broader about this, ESPN is a division of a massive corporation, namely Disney, and which is a publicly owned company that, has an obligation to make money. And I'm not saying they can't make money in the other ways. It's just, it seems like the inertia and just the basic sort of shareholder, pleasing logic is to not necessarily plagiarize. There's no rationale for that. That doesn't really make anyone money. But there is probably some incentive to continue alongside the great stuff, producing this sort of cheaper programming that's naturally going to tend toward this crappy stuff.
And it gets respectable ratings. I mean, First Take, which is the leader. I mean, as much as we love PTI, First Take is a show with tremendous, they get really high ratings. Sometimes they beat SportsCenter, which is on ESPN. So you have some.
They beat SportsCenter in ratings?
Occasionally beat SportsCenter, and that's one of the things that's ridiculous. That's one of the reasons why we saw so much Tim Tebow coverage on ESPN this past year, because First Take went all in on Tebow last year when Tebow was with the Broncos, which is a perfect time to cover Tim Tebow. That's the right time to cover Tim Tebow. There's no problem with covering Tim Tebow at that moment. But you have First Take going bonkers on Tim Tebow last year and would occasionally touch or beat ESPN on some days, ESPN being on, being SportsCenter, SportsCenter being on ESPN, First Take being on ESPN2. And then all of a sudden, when the summer rolled around, SportsCenter responded with, with programming strategies where they said, we have to talk up Tebow because we can't let First Take.
They went to like Jets training camp,
and
right?
then all of a sudden, they set up tent in Jets training camp, and we're there for several days with several reporters and lots of cameras. And the reason they were doing that was trying to neutralize some of First Take's ratings gains. And then suddenly, something that just started off in the little world, the little morning world of Stephen A. Smith and Skip Bayless, had spread all over the network. And that's one of the reasons why ESPN has put its watermark in the Tim Tebow story. Was what started as a very tiny intramural ratings war against two networks as part of the same big family. And that's one of the problems with having those debate shows, because what can be just localized to just its time slot of 10 a.m. to noon on ESPN2, all of a sudden, if ratings are ratings, then everybody's talking it up, and that's what's not good. But with that said, you have ESPN's point of view, but gratefully there are other places to get your sports news as well, or to watch sports games. And Mark, one of the things that we're big fans of, Sunday Night Football, which just wrapped up its season last night with the wild card playoff game. And Sunday Night Football is going to finish the year for a second consecutive year as the number one rated show in America, which is only the second time a sports program did it, and that was Sunday Night Football last year.
I thought of you watching it last night because some point in the game, maybe second quarter, third quarter, the Packers were already pretty far up on the Vikings, but it was the type of situation, maybe it was before a third down, a third and long for the Vikings, and that is when Sunday Night Football, which is broadcasting Saturday night, but it's the Sunday Night Football program on NBC, chose to broadcast their sort of quick 5-second pre-recorded segment on Packers linebacker Clay Matthews. Presumably because they thought this would be a pretty good moment for Clay Matthews maybe to make a good play, and so they'd show the segment, maybe he makes a good play. So they show the segment, and then literally, next snap, Clay Matthews comes in, strip sacks Joe Webb, and recovers the fumble, makes a huge momentum-turning play. And it's just a testament to something that you wrote an excellent Deadspin article about, which is that Sunday Night Football is a miracle. Well, not miracle, because it's actually very explainable. It's just it's one of the just best produced television shows of any kind on the air. Tell us a little about what you learned, reporting on Sunday Night Football.
I didn't learn a lot in terms of reporting that you can't already see on TV, but yeah, it's 2 or 3 months ago, somewhere actually toward the beginning of the football season, I wanted to do something on Sunday Night Football because I was thinking, if this is any other show in America, whether it be X Factor or American Idol or whatever, there would be a story written about the producer of the show and why is the show so great. I mean,
oh my God, there'd be like a front cover New York Times Magazine profile. I mean, there would be.
The Hollywood Reporter would be, there would be 25 profiles by that point. And yet I had really read nothing about the guys behind Sunday Night Football. You can read plenty about Al Michaels and Chris Collinsworth, the two lead announcers for Sunday Night Football. Maybe even read
who are great. I love them, by the way. Actually,
they're fantastic. Really but one of the things that as I started covering sports media a little bit more, a name that had popped up over and over again was this guy named Fred Gaudelli. And it was actually, he has an interesting backstory because this is a guy who spent his entire career at ESPN, and then just as Sunday Night Football was coming together, and it formed, the first game they broadcast was in 2006, NBC poached him, along with Al Michaels and John Madden, and Fred Gaudelli's director, Drew Esikoff. As it was coming together, all of a sudden, here's an ex-ESPNer who shows that there is a different way of doing games and a different way to do things. And, the easiest way to describe the difference between Sunday Night Football and how it broadcasts things versus ESPN was an anecdote that I heard as I was reporting the story out. And this wound up not making it into the story, but it's a great anecdote, which is, when Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, when they were getting ready for the first game that was going to be played at the new Cowboys Stadium, Jerry Jones told the NFL, I want it to be on NBC because if it's on Sunday Night Football, then it's just about the football game, and it's just going to be about the stadium. If it's on ESPN and Monday Night Football, a lot of it's going to be about ESPN. And, that's really just sort of a perfect way to describe, as much as you make me cringing for me to be using a Jerry Jones anecdote.
No. I mean,
but, it really is, that's...
He was on Sunday Night Football last Sunday, too. So.
Right. And, Sunday Night Football is really a dorky football program. And I think that's one of the reasons why it appeals to you and it appeals to me. It's because it is a show for football dorks. And as, there are channels like Red Zone where we can watch football highlights for 6 hours, almost live every day. The fact that everybody's got their own fantasy team. The fact that football is more popular than ever and just getting increasingly popular, and TV ratings keep going up. Considering all that, I think a lot of football fans are considering themselves like little mini head coaches. I think they think they're smarter, and they are smarter. They understand the game better. Everybody's getting a little bit more nuanced, and this is happening as the game itself is getting more sophisticated. And as a result, this is the program that really, really tries to appeal to that audience because it tries to be a dorky show about football. A smart guys, if you're a smart football fan, you want to watch a show. And with that, they also do all the glitz well. They have the Faith Hill intro, something my boyfriend really likes. You have the John Williams intros and outros for the show. So it looks like a primetime game. It's got the spectacle of a Super Bowl game every week. They do that extremely well. And on top of that, you have Chris Collinsworth really, really getting into the nitty-gritty of here's what happened, on the offensive line that created that play.
But it's accessible too. When friends of mine who don't really like football ask me like, how should I get into football? I say, watch Sunday Night Football. Listen to Chris Collinsworth. You will learn so much about just how the game works, both at a very granular, esoteric level, but also at a basic level. Like, you will understand the game better.
Mm-hmm. And as much as this guy is often made fun of, baseball's equivalent of Chris Collinsworth used to be Tim McCarver. Before Tim is a little shticky now, he's old. But when Tim was in his heyday, and Tim McCarver was the announcer on Channel 9 for Mets games when I was growing up. Tim used to be the best in the business, and it's the same reason for Chris Collinsworth is now, which is he's very instructive, or at least he was more instructive before he became totally condescending, but very instructive, and could see things in the game that really not many people either A, can see, and B, has a gift of explaining it extremely well. I mean, you were just talking about the Clay Matthews play. There was a moment in the 2001 World Series where in Game 7 between the Yankees and Diamondbacks, that classic World Series, where Luis Gonzalez, a left-handed hitter for the Diamondbacks, was up. Mariano Rivera was on the mound. And I think the Diamondbacks were down by a run. I can't remember if the bases were loaded or if they had runners at the corners, or they had runners at first and third base. But there was a situation where Joe Torre decided to move the entire infield in on a play. And there must have been one out or no outs. And he moved the entire infield in. It was the bottom of the ninth inning. And McCarver then says, this is a risky decision by Joe Torre by moving the entire infield in. I would just move the corner infielders in and keep the middle infielders, the shortstop and the second baseman, back on this play because the fact that Mariano Rivera throws a cut fastball, which is going to cut in on a left-handed hitter, and it might force a pop-up in the middle of the infield. A pitch or two later, all of a sudden, there comes the cut fastball. Luis Gonzalez winds up popping it into shallow center field just beyond where the shortstop would have been. It winds up sailing over Derek Jeter's head, and the game-tying and game-winning run scored. The Diamondbacks win the World Series. That's the sort of stuff you see on Sunday Night Football all the time. So the Clay Matthews thing, it's the least surprising thing to hear in the world. I didn't even see that play last night, but that stuff happens because, Fred Gaudelli, the guy who's the producer, probably could be an NFL coach in some way because this guy's been looking at film for over 20 years. I mean, this guy is really, really smart, and the broadcast is really smart.
NFL owners, you heard it from John Koblin. The 5 or 6 of you Buffalo announced their coach. They hired the Syracuse coach this morning, which is weird because he had like a 500 record at Syracuse, which is not necessarily known for its football program. But so Buffalo has a coach, but they're still Eagles. There's your next coach. I wanted to. We're basically out of time, but I did something that could have been much earlier. We could do this lightning round style, as though it's PTI. You know, been following your career. You were writing for several years. Before Deadspin, you were at Women's Wear Daily, and you were at the New York Observer as a media reporter. At both places, your boss was the fantastic Peter Kaplan, who has an old saying about the way the New York Observer covered the New York Times, which is that we're going to cover the New York Times the way the Washington Post covers the State Department, because it's the equivalent. And so for Deadspin, obviously, the State Department is ESPN. The ESPN is the State Department and several other branches of government. How everyone knows ESPN is insular, but you're actually one of the best people to ask this. How does ESPN compare in terms of insularity, in terms of self-criticism or lack thereof, and all those things you look for in terms of transparency, to the other news organizations like the Times, maybe Murdoch, News Corp, take News Corp, you know, other media organizations you've covered?
I mean, there's no comparison. I mean, as far as just sort of journalistic ethic issues are concerned, ESPN's way behind all of them in a way that really surprised me. But with that said, every place winds up being its own little Swiss village. I mean, the New York Times is as guilty of this as anybody else. I mean, I remember there was a time where in 2008, when the media world was really starting to collapse, things hadn't completely collapsed at the Times yet. They cut 100 jobs early in 2008, which was the first time they ever had to resort to layoffs at the New York Times. But that's at the same time that layoffs were happening all over the media world. And then in 2009, I mean, at a place like Condé Nast, I mean, which is regarded, has long been regarded as the greatest magazine company in the world, in 2009, Condé Nast they folded 6 magazines that year. They cut hundreds and hundreds of jobs. It was a terrible time all over the media world. And I remember at the end of 2009, the New York Times cut an additional 100 jobs. And I remember I heard from one of my good sources at the Times, who informed me about the fact that there are going to be 100 more job cuts. And then this person said to me, "John, what's happening to my newspaper? I can't believe this is happening," you know, and was really upset. And I was thinking, you're just cutting 100 jobs out of a newsroom that is going from 1,300 to 1,200. There are places that don't exist now. And it was at that moment where I really realized, wow, the New York Times, though it winds up covering media itself, they really don't know what's happening up and down the street, do they? So every news outfit, every media place is its own little Swiss village. But as far as how ESPN responds to things, as far as how ESPN winds up finding itself in hot water, the fact that I find that people have more of a conflicted relationship with ESPN than they do with, say, the New York Times or Wall Street Journal. Yeah, ESPN is extremely different from any other news outfit. If we're just considering ESPN, sort of the news division part, they're well behind, because the New York Times, even the Wall Street Journal, even the New York Post from time to time, usually fairly quick to correcting things, usually pretty upfront and open with talking with talking about their own coverage. ESPN is a lot slower when it comes to that, but maybe we'll make something.
Now, the excuses you'd make is that it's younger than those news organizations, and that unlike those news organizations, it's not only a news organization; they also broadcast actual events. They're not just a news organization, which of course leads to its own thorny problems, but it also means maybe it's a little harder. So I guess the question would be, given those somewhat extenuating circumstances, is there valid hope that this is part of an evolution and we could genuinely see them getting better?
I mean, possibly. I mean, the one other thing that has to be considered, I mean, I'm sitting here complaining about ESPN, but the other thing that, hey, there's Bennett.
Sorry, I just my phone.
The other thing that, you have to consider is the fact that ESPN is the only one that is as wildly successful as it is. I mean, the Wall Street Journal does not make money. The New York Times makes only a little bit of money. ESPN is hugely, hugely, hugely successful. So they're doing something that that the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and a lot of other news outfits aren't doing. So as a result, ESPN maybe they just don't care as much to to get the journalistic score as close to an A as possible as the other places do. But if they did, then all of a sudden we would have the best of all worlds, where we would have the resources and the money dedicated to, as you put it, the Grantlands of the world, the fact that you could do lots of investigative reporting, the fact that you could have the Adam Schefters, get all that, and then we don't have to see the Bad Angel either.
Well, it's funny, with hockey coming back, and with EPL coming in August, NBC Sports Network's going to be making some noise. I think Fox is going to do one, probably others. I mean, none of them are going to get to where ESPN is anytime remotely soon, but I feel like a little competition could probably do ESPN good, because that's just the way things work.
I hope so, too.
If you have to.
I'm cautiously optimistic. It's going to take a long time for, as you said, for any of those channels to even come close to ESPN, but...
Yeah. Well, right. I mean, there's no comparison. I mean, I think really people used to discussing, like, the, financial news industry, I think probably just wouldn't have an appreciation of how thoroughly ESPN dominates this space. It's just, there's really no analog anywhere else. To the extent that we spent almost this whole time talking about it, and that's actually a completely natural thing to do. John, I want to thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
I hope you'll root for the Redskins.
I'm rooting very hard for the Redskins. I would love to see you guys in the divisional playoffs. And, then if you win this game, and of course, by the time anybody's actually watching this, all this will be realized, but you can, I think the Atlanta game, if you wind up winning, is eminently winnable.
Very winnable. Very winnable.
Probably more winnable than this one. And then all of a sudden, you could be in the championship game, and that would be quite thrilling.
Who's your Super Bowl champion pick?
That's a good question. I'm going with Denver in the AFC because here's my big bet. The Houston Texans will beat the New England Patriots next weekend.
Not bad. I totally
the reason the Texans have not been the same since they lost that Monday night game to New England, a month ago or so. That is exactly what happened to the Jets 2 years ago. In fact, the Jets were blown out by an even wider margin.
Oh, it was plenty
the Texans were. The Jets lost 45-3, came back a month later, beat New England in New England in the divisional playoffs. I, as a result, think the Texans will wind up winning next weekend. I would love to see the Patriots lose. So I'm going with Broncos in the AFC. I think the 49ers in the NFC, and I'm going with the 49ers for the Super Bowl. But what do I know? I mean,
my prediction actually is, while I'll be rooting probably for the Texans, I'm not sure I'm quite as optimistic about you. I do see the Pats winning that game, and I see them going into Denver and beating Denver, and I see the Niners beating the Pats.
That would make me equally happy. I would love to watch Bill Belichick.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Another Super Bowl.
There you go. Well, thank you so much. This has been great, and everyone enjoy the football. Bye. And you can even watch the BCS Championship game tonight on where else?
ESPN.
Talk to you later, John.
Thanks so much, Mark.